So now let's turn to our first keynote of this gathering. Please join me in warmly welcoming St Ethelburga's Co-Director, Clare Martin.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to start with just a little exercise, a little fun exercise. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like you to answer by holding up one of the cards. So, if your answer to the question is a really strong yes, I want you to hold up the dark green card. If it's a very strong no, you're at the other end of the spectrum, pale green. If it's a maybe, sort of in the middle, you hold up the middle green card. And then you've got another option, which I'm going to call the joker or the wild card. So this is like not applicable, none of the above. You're somewhere on the outside of the spectrum, yes, no, maybe. Right? So we'll start with an easy one, hopefully. Do you like baked beans? Who here could murder a baked bean? I love a baked bean. Okay, some people, we got some haters, okay? We got some people who, you'll eat it if it's on your plate. And we have got some wild cards, great. Maybe you've never tried baked beans, maybe you're allergic to beans. Okay, right, so try another one. Again, just to get to grips with the idea of it. Okay, who pours their milk before the tea? Pour the milk before the tea? I do not. I am opposed to this, okay? We haven't got many who pour the milk before the tea. We've got a lot of after the tea. We have quite a lot of wild cards, because let's face it, this is a bit of a dumb question. Maybe we've got a lot of coffee drinkers, maybe we've got a lot of herbal tea drinkers, so that's why we're seeing a lot of wild cards. Okay, before I go on to some more relevant questions, I just want to highlight to us all that throughout the day, we're going to be hearing different perspectives, different world views on issues that I'm sure we'll all feel very urgently and passionately about. And at any given point, whatever's being said in the plenary or in a workshop session, we ourselves may be anywhere on this spectrum of yes, I agree, no, I'm not sure, or wild card. We're going to be having that whole spectrum of responses, and everyone around us is going to be having that spectrum of responses. Okay. So who here belongs to a community of faith or belief? Okay. Whose beliefs have evolved somewhat beyond the faith tradition into which you were born? Thank you. Do you feel concern for Earth, our shared home? Love and concern, yes. So it'll reassure you to know that in this country you're not alone. 80% of people surveyed across political tribes care about climate as an issue. Okay, do you sometimes have awkward disagreements with people that you love about politics or worldview? Do you sometimes withhold your opinions to make life a bit easier? Okay, here's another question along the same lines. Coming here today, scanning this room, do you have a sense you might be holding an outlier perspective in this room? Does anyone feel they might, I might hold an outlier perspective here, maybe? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. So some people do. Right, again, so if you're withholding views or feeling like there's views that you're sitting with in an echo chamber that can't be expressed, again, you're not alone. 76% of people in this country surveyed report withholding their true opinions for fear of receiving some form of negative reprisal. That's across the political spectrum. Similarly, 60% of people across all political tribes feel fatigued and exhausted with how divisive our political conversations have become, and they are yearning for an alternative. So now I'd just like to ask you a few questions really about how you feel when you consider our future with Earth. Do you feel afraid? Ever? Do you often find yourself compartmentalizing, that you put fears and concerns and headlines in one place and the rest of your life in another? Do you feel grief? Thank you. Do you sometimes feel like your values, your faith, is quite agitated and awake inside of you and longing to be lived? Do you feel hope? Thank you. Can everyone here think of a place in nature that's special and sacred to you that you love? Can I ask us just to take maybe 20 seconds and close our eyes and just summon that place into our hearts and hold it in our hearts? Thank you. Now I'd like to invite you to turn to your neighbor. I'm going to ask you to share for 1 minute each and tell your neighbor about that special place that is sacred to you, why it matters to you, and why you love it. And I'll tell you at 1 minute to switch over. Thank you. Welcome back. When I was 14, I joined a student anti-nuclear group, and this was really my sort of first experience of peace and environmental activism coming together. And I remember going every Saturday morning to the YMCA in Montreal, where I grew up, and sitting in a circle on the floor. And I remember one of my overriding memories of these meetings is of being really worried about how I could sit on the floor in my very tiny miniskirt while completely maintaining my dignity. It was a red plaid miniskirt, and it had a viscose lining in it, which meant, especially if I had another top tucked into it, it would kind of start to ride up. But worse than that, every step that I took, it would kind of slide a little bit around my waist, so I might look down and find the back zip right down the front, which was very bad. And then I would start yanking it back around, but this had the danger of setting off a perfect storm of static electricity. So my whole outfit would kind of stick to my body, and it would get in my hair, and my hair would, you're feeling me. It was not pretty. So yes, I was very anxious about nuclear arms escalation, also a little bit preoccupied by my miniskirt. And when I tell you how handsome the boy was, who was one of the main leaders of this group, you'll understand why, yes, the environmental impacts of nuclear fallout and the problem of nuclear waste storage. And also, what would it be like to kiss him? How could I make him notice me? All of these things were very intensely important all at the same time. I wasn't a very good activist, in case that isn't already really quite obvious. They would give me really simple jobs to do, like photocopy these leaflets, but the photocopier would jam, and I would be stabbing the buttons and kicking the photocopier, and then I'd just sort of panic and slip away and hope nobody would notice. The main strategy of this activist group was to create chapters inside of all of the high schools of the students. And by this point, most of these older activists had done that, and now it was my turn. The problem was I was going to have to ask my head teacher for permission to open a club, but I was pathologically shy, and also I had an unholy terror of my headmistress, who was a scary nun. I wish that I could tell you that when I summoned every ounce of courage that was in me to go and knock on her door, that I did it because I cared so much about the existential risks of nuclear arms. But the truth is, it was all about the boy. My headmistress said no. And after that, I would go back and sit in those meetings and ask myself, does it really matter that I'm here? Then one night, we all snuck into a club. We drank tequila sunrises. I danced to this boy all night. And I thought, oh, I'd arrived. The next meeting, the 4 oldest members of this activist group, including this boy, made an announcement. They'd been meeting privately over the past number of months, and they had designed a new strategy for the group, which would position them at the center of a media tour and as the key leadership circle who would make all of the core decisions for this group going forward. I felt a very strange atmosphere mounting in the room. I didn't really understand what was happening, and I raised my hand and I said, but what about our democratic principles? The boy had obviously come prepared to face down an objection like this. And he said, yes, let's make it democratic. Who here wants Clare to be elected to the inner leadership circle? Does anyone want to speak in favor of this motion? And nobody did. He spoke against the motion. And when he asked for a vote, obviously everyone voted against it. And in that moment, I knew I had the answer to my question. Does it matter that I'm here? No. Doesn't matter that I'm here. Right? These gigantic problems facing the world should be handled by proper people. People who could work photocopiers and miniskirts. And people who knew when to keep their big mouths shut. Why am I telling you this story? Today, we are going to be hearing from some extraordinary leaders and thinkers in the fields of spiritual ecology and peacemaking and future thinking. I look forward to sitting down where you are and learning from them. I felt that I wanted to open today speaking from the perspective of an ordinary person. Because I think a lot of people feel like they're the dweeb who can't even work the photocopier, let alone know who they should trust to explain to them why we face so many complex, interconnected civilizational problems, or who they should trust to explain to them how they should respond. I think a lot of people long to make a contribution, but are intimidated by the way activists often behave. But ultimately, for me, this is a story about fear and vulnerability, and how hard it can be to show up with your heart open to these questions, and to stand on the threshold where your personal inner life meets the outer public world, where you're holding your longing to be of service out there in public and with other people. How hard it is to stand on that threshold. I know for myself, after this experience with the activist group, I spent years ricocheting from sitting on a meditation cushion to then doing some outer foray, into some outer form of activism, but always avoiding the place in the middle where the two met, because I knew that was the scariest place to be. That was the place where you could get your heart broken, either by something small and personal like a boy, or by something overwhelming and unfathomable like the shadow of existential risk hanging over your own life and the life of every living being on earth. Today's conference is a part of a longer series of events exploring faith and moral courage. And I think that for all of us, this question about how to live our deepest values, our faith, with utmost courage, calls for us to stand on this threshold, this place where inner and outer life meet. And I think it's so easy to sort of tip one side of that threshold or another. So for example, today it could be quite easy to tip over to the spiritual side of the spiritual ecology theme, or to tip onto the side of ecology, solution building, sense making. And for me, the whole essence and the purpose of this work is to hold these two things together, to stand on the threshold. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time exploring this theme about thresholds. So this is a saying that I really love by the great Christian, Celtic Christian poet and philosopher John O'Donoghue, who wrote, "We are the custodians of deep and ancient thresholds." And I really love this idea that we approach these threshold places with an attitude of custodianship and care, that we think of ourselves as custodians not of a position or of an outer project or a space or even of an inner space. Rather, we are the custodian of a space of possibility where different spaces meet and have the potential to interpenetrate. I think of O'Donoghue as a great theologian, a great Christian theologian of spiritual ecology, though he wouldn't have called himself that. And he writes a lot about threshold places, often situating them in landscapes. And so he writes, "The earth is full of thresholds where beauty awaits the reverent presence. The earth is full of thresholds where beauty awaits the reverent presence." So this is the idea of a thin place in the Celtic imagination, this idea that the earth is constantly presenting these invitations, these opportunities to be saturated, to dwell completely in an experience of beauty, and all that's required is that we stand at the threshold with a certain quality of reverence. Did you know that one of these thresholds runs right down the middle of this room? And it's because of one man who rediscovered it that we have the ability to be here and experience it today. So the day after the 1993 bombing, which targeted the financial district all around here, but which leveled the ancient church which had previously stood on this site, the Bishop of London, at the time Bishop Richard Chartres, came to pray standing here in the ashes. So he placed one foot, so to speak, inside of his spiritual practice, in his inner disciplines, the other foot straddling the threshold, in a very clear-eyed understanding of the extremely painful, complex conflict out of which this explosion had arisen. He straddled this threshold in a place in a landscape, yes, very much interfered with by human hands, nevertheless a place in a landscape where for hundreds of years people had been bringing their reverent presence to remember what was most sacred. When he stewarded this threshold, something happened. Something stepped across. A vision of a space reconstructed not as another place of Christian worship, but as the space we sit in now, a space for reconciliation and peace. And sometimes when I'm alone here, I stand in this room and I let my vision go a little bit hazy. And I feel into the truth that I'm not just standing here in a building made out of marble and glass and stone. I'm standing inside of the electrifying moment of visionary experience inside of one man's prayer. The story of St Ethelburga is very much bound up with the story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This was a centuries-long conflict involving war, conquest, the desecration of indigenous lands as a tool of conquest. It involved migration, cultural change, sectarian violence, faith-based violence. Whenever I open a space here, I'm mindful of this history, and I feel grateful for the peacemakers who stewarded thresholds between those who were in conflict with one another, threshold between a past of endless violence that people despaired could ever be resolved, and an at that time as yet unknown future. That future was the Good Friday Agreement. And one of the features of the Good Friday Agreement was the use of something called constructive ambiguity. Constructive ambiguity is the intentional and positive use of ambiguity in a peace agreement where intense disagreement can be resolved in no other way. And there were a number of instances of its use in the Good Friday Agreement. But the one I would like to highlight is the absence of a hard border in the Irish Sea. I often think about ambiguity in the context of reconciliation and peacemaking, and I personally believe that ambiguity and the ability to withstand paradox is a much under-recognized civic virtue, very much needed in our time. Here in the Good Friday Agreement, I see its use as another really practical example of what it means to steward a threshold, to hold two competing positions, inherently contradictory realities, together at the same time. And whenever I think about the term constructive ambiguity, I have this sense impression of being out on the Irish Sea. And I think it's not an accident that this piece of legalistic ambiguity is a place where the body of earth reasserts her sovereignty, resisting human borders and delineation. And I have this sort of visual image of the waters of the Irish Sea pouring out of the pages of the peace agreement. And I think it's a powerful image for how stewarding thresholds in our inner lives, in conflicts with one another, in a landscape, can offer a way forward in dark and uncertain times. So, my invitation to you today is that we could be custodians of a threshold together. That we could do this as an act of faith and moral courage. That we could do this together because sometimes things that are tricky and take a bit of courage to do are better done together. That collectively, individually, we could root one foot very firmly inside of our spiritual practice or inner disciplines, another foot very firmly in a clear-eyed and compassionate looking at the reality that we're in a world currently at 1.6 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures and rising. That we can straddle this threshold here in a space, in a landscape, where people have been remembering what's most sacred for centuries. That we can do this with a certain sense of adventure. That this is a place where something unexpected, even something unexpectedly hopeful can happen. Like the resurrection of a building from the ashes, like the creation of a peace agreement, where really for decades no one thought that was anywhere near a possibility. Or even just the unexpectedness of a moment of beauty arriving in our hearts, like a moment of grace. That's what I'm going to be doing today. I would love it if you would join me in stewarding this threshold. What do you think of my invitation? Will you join me? Thank you.
So now what we're going to do is we just have a few minutes. If you have a comment or a question for Clare, can I just invite you to stand?
Yeah, it really touched me, everything you said. And I'm thinking that the challenge spiritually is to come to a place of non-duality between the inner and the outer worlds. And then it's obvious that it's not a problem to take on the outer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I was very touched by the phrase you used, if I got it down correctly, the electrifying moment of visionary experience of one man's prayer, standing in that. And it was like a whole bunch of things just dropped into place about my relationship with St Ethelburga historically. And it also speaks to the importance of those places where, as the gentleman who just spoke mentioned, we come to rest really easily in the threshold of that liminality between the relative and the ultimate in the non-dual, and the importance of those belly button places in our lives and the people. And I had this vision of the sense of how they tether, how, like guy ropes, how they keep you upright on your own thresholds in your life, and of how those map. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about who the people are and the places are where you find those belly buttons.
Love that. Thank you so much. Yes, Nadine over here.
Thank you very much. That was a really palatable story. I may ask you just a little bit to elaborate what do you mean by constructive ambiguity? Thank you.
So constructive ambiguity is a term that's used in the context of peacemaking agreements, and this is one of the features of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. So this is where very intense disagreements between parties who are seeking to resolve hot conflict can't be resolved in terms that make sense in either of those different worldviews, where a certain space is left in the peace agreement, where territory is deliberately left undefined. And so the lack of a border in the Irish Sea was one of those features. I think the Good Friday Agreement also left the issue of republicanism deliberately open and unresolved. And so that meant at that particular time, there was not a majority political will amongst all parties on the issue of reunification. But the peace agreement does specify that should such a moment arrive at any point in the future, then all parties would be obliged to collaborate to make that issue come about. So those are just two examples of the use of constructive ambiguity. But I think it's, you know, I think it's, peacemaking is so much about pragmatism, and it's often about sacrifice. And I think there's something so incredibly honorable about the scale of compromise that all parties were able to bring to the Good Friday Agreement. You can tell that story as a heroic story, which of course it is, but also at the time, you know, you could hardly find one individual on any side of that issue who didn't feel that the sacrifices that they were making for the sake of the peace were egregious, were extraordinarily painful. So I don't know if that gives a little bit more detail. And I know that constructive ambiguity has been used in other peace agreements globally. I'm not as familiar with those cases.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation into the day. I noticed how it was both like relieving to have the part of myself that kind of wants to hold difference or disagreement, to have that welcomed into the space. And I would be curious to hear more about how you might envision like holding difference in the day, what that might look like. And I'm aware you've got these principles of holding conversations across difference, and that might be referring to that. But yeah, I would be interested what that could look like today in terms of process and structure as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we have our principles for convening conversations across difference, which I think would be helpful, to refer to. We've got our comments board. So I think there's, please do engage with the comments board. I think it's a place where whatever may feel unvoiced, whatever needs to be spoken into the room, this is another context where that can be offered. I'd really warmly encourage and invite everyone to reach out and to, there are some extraordinary people on the plenary. There's some incredible people in the audience today. And I think just reaching out and meeting people and engaging in those conversations, I think we're hoping to build a lot of dialogue throughout the day. So after each one of the keynotes, there will be an opportunity for people to talk and to raise comments. And, and I think one of the principles that you'll find in the principles for dialogue is that we invite ourselves and our communities to express our views honestly and fully, with full expectation that you will receive a fair hearing. And I think for anyone who may be feeling, holding that question about, well, what does that really mean to engage with difference? Because it's easy to talk about in a poetic way, but often actually doing it is where the rubber hits the road and can be painful and difficult. But I think that if we're all happy to hold those principles, to take them seriously, and to make that presumption of good faith, both when we're sharing views, even views that we think might feel edgy in the room, and also when we're listening to those views.
Thank you so much, Claire. Please give another round of applause for Clare Martin. Thank you so much, Claire.